If you had told me years ago that we would witness NATO, the powerhouse of military alliances, essentially frozen while its main competitor quietly established a new strategic zone, I wouldn't have believed it. Yet here we are. Russia has opened a new front, but not in Ukraine, not in the Baltics, and not in the Arctic. This is different. It's strategic, asymmetric, and a masterclass in misdirection. Despite NATO's intelligence networks, forward bases, and decades of preparation, the alliance was caught off guard. This is not about simple military tactics. It's about a fundamental shift in global power structures. The tectonic plates of international influence are moving, and the West is just beginning to feel the tremors. For the first time in decades, Russia has flipped the script, pushing NATO into a defensive posture in a region the alliance assumed it controlled: the Caucasus. This corridor links Moscow to the broader south and east, bypassing choke points under Western influence. Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, these nations are pivotal to Eurasian connectivity. While NATO's attention was elsewhere, Russia secured a strategic advantage. Emergency meetings, calls between world leaders, and formal protests followed. But behind the diplomatic noise, the reality is stark. NATO has limited options. The West assumed economic pressure would bring Moscow to heel, but Russia built parallel systems, new supply chains, alliances, and independent financial networks that are fully operational. This isn't about ideology, it's survival. NATO's structure was built for a singular mission: deterring Soviet aggression in Europe. That model works for clear geographic threats. But what happens when influence is exerted subtly across regions rather than through direct confrontation? This is the challenge. Russia isn't seeking open conflict with NATO members, which would trigger a collective response. Instead, it is expanding influence in areas where NATO cannot act decisively. Even Turkey, a NATO member, has interests intertwined with Azerbaijan. They rely on Russian energy and trade, so any Western enforcement becomes complicated. Russia has identified the seams in the alliance, the points where geography, economics, and history divide member nations, and is exploiting them with precision. The fragility we see is not externally imposed. It is partly a result of NATO's own expansion. Absorbing former Warsaw Pact nations and extending the alliance eastward seemed logical, but every new member added obligations and stretched resources thinner. Strategy is about knowing what you cannot defend as much as what you can. NATO stopped asking whether it had the capacity to defend every extended frontier. Now assets are spread thin across the Baltics, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, and even the Arctic, while the US encourages Europe to watch east toward China. Amid this, Russia opens a new strategic front in the Caucasus, and the options for NATO are limited. Military intervention risks escalation. Economic measures are already maximized. So what remains is diplomacy, statements of concern, and emergency meetings while Russia continues advancing. This is the irony of current Western limitations: expansion and sanctions, once tools of influence, have become constraints. Russia isn't trying to take the Caucasus outright. It wants to control flow, build trade corridors linking Russia to Iran, India, and beyond, bypassing Europe entirely. The West's leverage over historic trade routes diminishes as new routes emerge. The international north-south transport corridor is being built, financed, and operationalized. NATO cannot stop it. You cannot repel a trade agreement or restrict a corridor of commerce with military might. Russia doesn't need to defeat NATO militarily, it only needs to render it less relevant. If the global economy shifts to parallel networks, what are traditional military advantages protecting? History shows that empires rarely fall in battle. They falter when the global structure moves against them. The Caucasus is part of a larger reorganization. Parallel systems like BRICS are expanding, not militarily, but economically, offering alternatives to Western institutions. Nations are hedging dependence on Western financial systems. seeking security and diversification. Once built, these systems endure. Trade settles in local currencies, new energy markets emerge, and infrastructure solidifies long-term shifts. The Caucasus Corridor links multiple regions, forming a Eurasian supereconomy independent of traditional Western centers. NATO's military power cannot halt this. Traditional kinetic tools are irrelevant against economic gravity. This brings us to a concept called imperial liquidation. Unlike sudden collapse, liquidation is managed, a slow recognition that maintaining dominance is no longer sustainable. After 1945, Britain didn't vanish, but voluntarily reduced its global commitments, passing leadership to the US. Today, Western dominance faces a similar reckoning. The US and NATO are not defeated militarily, but the cost of maintaining global influence is unsustainable. Their primary levers, currency, sanctions, and military commitments, yield diminishing returns while rivals seize opportunities. Russia's Caucasus strategy tests this exact limitation, probing the West's bandwidth and willingness to defend distant regions. The result is strategic triage, prioritizing areas that can realistically be held while allowing others to drift from influence. Liquidation does not equal extinction. Britain remained a global player despite downsizing. Similarly, the West will retain influence but will no longer dictate global rules unilaterally. The future is multipolar. Decisions will be brokered in Beijing, Moscow, New Delhi, and Riyadh. Negotiation, not diktat, becomes essential. The Caucasus maneuver is a reality check, signaling the end of the unipolar moment. Weaponized finance and overextension encouraged other nations to create alternative pathways. We are moving from unquestioned dominance to necessary negotiation. Global stability will increasingly depend on recognizing complexity rather than forcing alignment. The world is not collapsing. It is reorganizing, and understanding this shift is critical to interpreting future developments. What we are witnessing is not merely a regional chess move, it is a global rebalancing of power, influence, and opportunity. The traditional levers of Western authority, economic pressure, military alliances, and political coercion no longer function with the same predictability they once did. For decades, the West operated under the assumption that its structural advantages were unassailable, that the combination of military presence, currency dominance, and control over international financial systems would naturally deter competitors from creating parallel infrastructures. That assumption is being tested, and the test is revealing cracks in a system that once seemed airtight. The Caucasus Corridor is emblematic of this. By establishing influence in this region, Russia is signaling to the world that geography and infrastructure matter as much as military power. Trade routes, pipelines, and logistics hubs are now the true battlegrounds for influence, and nations are fast realizing that relying solely on military alliances for security is no longer sufficient. We need to understand the psychology behind these moves. Nations are not making these shifts out of ideology. They are making them out of necessity. The shock waves of sanctions, freezing of assets, and the demonstration of how dependent the world is on Western financial institutions have created a collective incentive to diversify. If one day a nation's financial access can be cut off by external powers, then the security of its citizens and its economy becomes contingent on someone else's goodwill. That is a strategic vulnerability no nation wants to endure. We are seeing this manifest in the development of new trade corridors, alternative currencies for international settlements, and independent energy agreements. These are not symbolic gestures. They are practical structural solutions designed to reduce reliance on any single dominant power. Consider the implications beyond immediate trade. When nations develop independent corridors, they also cultivate political and diplomatic leverage. A country with multiple options for energy imports, financial flows, or trade routes is inherently less susceptible to pressure. It can negotiate from a position of strength rather than one of dependence. This changes the very calculus of international diplomacy. For the West, this is uncomfortable because the assumption that leverage can always be translated into compliance no longer holds. Economic pressure, once considered an almost guaranteed tool to shape behavior, is being mitigated by diversification and strategic foresight. The era of predictable cause and effect in international affairs is giving way to an era